In the last episode, we spoke with Lou Ferrante about the history of the Mafia, including the key players. You may have noticed that the topic of Jack Ruby was conspicuously absent from most of that discussion. In this episode, we're putting our focus squarely on Jack Ruby and trying to answer two key questions. How close was Ruby to the Mafia, really? And why did Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald? In this 18th edition of Recaps and Rebuttals, we're joined by second-time guest on Solving JFK, Don from the Fourth Reich Archaeology podcast. Don and his partner Dick had a great series on Jack Ruby to add to their best-in-class series on the Warren Commission. We'll take all of the things we learned about Ruby on Solving JFK, supplement that with anything Don has to add that we're missing, and see if we can get some final determinations on Jack Ruby coming up next on Solving JFK.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The mission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
Don, great to have you back on the show.
It is great to be back, Matt. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. As you know, I was in the top 17% of your listeners on Fourth Reich Archaeology. And, for me, your series on the Warren Commission and the topic of today's episode, Jack Ruby, some of the best podcast work around for sure. I love how you and Don bring some informality and just a different perspective than everybody else. It's sort of a younger perspective, a more kind of like less trusting of authority. Not that people in the JFK critical community are super trusting, but you guys kind of bring a whole, a different level, a different perspective. So love your show, love what you're doing, and congratulations on your success.
Well, thank you. It really means a lot. I find it very validating, and it's an honor to hear that from you, an honor that you trust my work enough to bring me on here, because as you know, I'm a big fan of Solving JFK. So the feeling is definitely mutual, and we have built up a good body of work, and we're plowing on into even more of these noided and paranoid parapolitical topics. So
yes,
onward we go.
And so you guys have obviously you touch on current events as well, but some of the historic things that you guys have gone really, really deep on: Warren Commission, Jack Ruby, Gerald Ford, the attempted assassination on Gerald Ford, and all that, which yeah, I've only scratched the very surface of. Are there any other topics that you guys are looking at diving into, or that you still have to complete, or are you done with those?
Oh, there are so many more. I mean, so in coming up on what we're calling She Harvey Oswald, our series on the 2 would-be female assassins who both attempted allegedly to kill Gerald Ford, they touch on so many different topics, each one of them. So in our current part of that series, we're looking at Squeaky Fromy and the Manson family and all of the deep political significance around that issue. And with the next one, Sarah Jane Moore, she was, of course, tied up in the Symbionese Liberation Army. So we're going to be digging into that and the deep state ties in that respect as well. And when we get back into Jerry world, we're going to be turning back the clock, looking at Watergate in 2026. We're going to be looking at, all kinds of stuff. The coup in Chile, the war in Angola. Just we've found that using Gerald Ford as kind of our protagonist to take the hero's journey through the Fourth Reich history of the post-war U.S. political order is a rich vehicle to explore just any number of topics, not just in the 60s and 70s, but beyond.
Let's get to some Jack Ruby archaeology. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right. Okay, so recap and rebuttals. You kind of know the deal. I'm gonna recap the big picture things we talked about on Ruby. So the idea is, someone could listen to this and kind of get like a Cliff Notes, but really a lot is being left out. And if you want the citations, you got to go to the individual episodes. But every one of these things, I've got a document, or worst case scenario, I've got a book, right? And the book's not as good as a document, but anyway. And we have some special rebuttals from Fred Litwin today we're going to be covering. So looking forward to those a little later on. All right, let's get into it. So why does any of this matter? Why does Jack Ruby matter? Well, as everyone knows, Ruby's killing of Oswald permanently prevented any trial testimony about Oswald's motive or any possible other people that Oswald could have been involved with. And his actions don't match spontaneous grief. They align with access, timing, and institutional tolerance in the form of, the police allowing him to get in. Now, that's a disputed topic to some extent, but Ruby repeatedly implied that he was acting under pressure from powerful people. And, he confessed that the official story wasn't true. Now, there's a bit of a, like I said, there's a bit of a rebuttal on that particular thing we'll talk about later. But I'm not really sold on the rebuttal. But the point is, Ruby himself, we've got on tape a couple different times saying some things that you wouldn't expect a guy to say if he was a lone nut, which we got two lone nuts here. We can't forget Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut, and then the lone nut that kills the lone nut is Jack Ruby. Okay. And we're supposed to just not pay attention to any of his ties because lone nuts kill lone nuts all the time. In this episode, we're not going over the actual shooting of Oswald or how Ruby got into the building. We covered that in episode 26 if you want to go back and listen to a detailed analysis of that. And also, I want to point out that Paul Abbott is an Australian author who's really dedicated a lot of work. He's got a great book called Death to Justice about Ruby killing Oswald. So with that, we'll jump into Ruby's life. Any preliminary thoughts you have on Ruby?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, it's a fascinating story that not only tells us a lot about the JFK assassination and the forces that may have been behind it, but also, just his story. We talked about it on our series as kind of an immigrant and the model story of the poor immigrant coming up through a very gritty urban upbringing in Prohibition era Chicago of Al Capone. It's so rich, it's so textured and it goes beyond just JFK, and I think offers a lot of insights on the country that we all live in and are trying to make a better place.
Absolutely. So his early life, Ruby is born as Jacob Leon Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911. He's raised in unstable conditions. I mean, that's really an understatement. And he was in juvenile detention and foster homes. You guys talked about I think went into a little more detail on that. I mean, he really did have kind of a shaky upbringing, right? When he was just a kid.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think his dad was an abusive drunk. His mom had some problems with psychosis and he had, I think, 10 siblings, and they got split up and brought back together. So a very unstable family environment to the point where his real education was in the streets, I think, in a lot of
Right.
ways.
That's right. Speaking of, say he drops out of school at 16 and he delivers sealed envelopes for Al Capone. That was one way he made money, $1 an envelope for Al Capone. So one of the one of the two questions, the big questions we're trying to answer about Ruby is this guy Mafia affiliated? Does he have close relationships with the Mafia, any sort of relationship? And then, why did he kill Oswald? And right out of the gate, he's delivering envelopes, sealed envelopes for like the number one most famous gangster of the Prohibition era.
Maybe all time, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, if that's the only fact, then I would grant everyone, coincidences happen. But stand by, friends. There are many, many more. So,
Oh yeah.
here's one of the things that it was really, really sort of telling to me. He moved to Los Angeles in 1933, and he moved out there specifically to sell tip sheets for races at the Santa Anita racetrack. And at the same time, the same year, 1933, Johnny Roselli moved to LA to oversee gambling at the Santa Anita racetrack for the Chicago outfit. So they're both connected to these racetrack gambling operations. To me, it suggests that Ruby went out there at the same time as Roselli. Otherwise, I mean, that's quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's part of a bigger westward migration. I know we'll get into this a little bit more, but the you got to remember at this time, LA was on the up and up. The whole American West was really ripe for the pickings for the mafia. And so when Roselli goes out there, he is an envoy of sorts. I also want to say, you know who else worked at the Santa Anita, Matt?
Is that
Sirhan Sirhan.
at the same, not at the same time?
Not at the same time. It would
Yeah,
have been a
right.
little bit later,
That's
yeah,
crazy. Huh, interesting.
in the stables.
That's a very interesting footnote there. Well, you know what? I talked to Lou Ferrante recently, and this is a guy who was in the Gambino crime family, did some time in prison, and he told me that everything west of Chicago at the time was ruled by Chicago because that was where the mafia ended. So Chicago just kind of controlled everything west of Chicago. A pretty good
Yep.
deal. So.
Oh yeah.
Um, the next thing, so okay, so we have delivering envelopes for Al Capone and moving to Los Angeles to go do work at the same racetrack that Johnny Roselli moved to at the same time. Okay, maybe those are coincidences. What's he doing when he comes back to Chicago? Ruby goes to work for the union when he comes back to Chicago from LA, and it's the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union. And what's interesting isn't the mere fact of him, working for a union. It's that he stayed at the union after the mafia took it over and after the non-union founder, Leon Cook, was murdered during Ruby's tenure. So Ruby stays on, for a while with the mafia folks running everything. So that, and that's a little bit more colorful. I don't, do you have any more context on the union side of things?
Yeah, as I understand it, some of those reports from that murder even place Ruby at the scene of the crime. I don't know if it's confirmed. I don't think it's something to necessarily hang your hat on, but it is reported that he might have been there. And this is just another one of these amazing, probably coincidences, but just to show how small of a world we're dealing with in JFK land and the Warren Commission, that the guy who came into power in that union in the mafia era, who ended up being a real close associate of Jimmy Hoffa, was a guy called Paul Red Dorfman. And his stepson, Alan Dorfman, became a major client in a huge scandal represented by none other than super lawyer from Chicago, Burt Jenner, who
Uh,
was one of the senior counsel to the
uh,
Warren Commission and just another very, very interesting character. And the Dorfman family had a large amount of shared interests with Lester Crown, the Chicago's Crown family, who was the controlling shareholder of General Dynamics, the aerospace manufacturer with a massive presence in Fort Worth, where JFK was making massive amounts of reference to the Fort Worth-based Convair plant's recent win of the TFX contract on the visit on the very morning of November 22nd. So it's like a real small world there.
when I finally make my Charlie Day Always Sunny conspiracy web, I'm gonna send it to you, and then you can add some stuff, and then we can just literally people just think we're fully insane, and we'll just get committed. It'll be fun.
Oh yeah, we're gonna need like 30 feet by 30 feet for that one.
Here's the thing: we're gonna have citations on our little strings of yarn, so everyone can eat it. Sorry.
That's
All
right.
right. Okay. So far, Al Capone going out to Santa Anita, comes back and works for a union. All right, I mean, I'm open to the mafia, but it could be coincidence. Let's see where it goes. Okay, World War II, he's drafted in 1943. He serves honorably as an aircraft mechanic. And then in post-war, he comes back from World War II and he starts a manufacturing business with his brothers. Basically, I called it like trinkets. Like they're just building like junk. I don't like and selling it. I wasn't clear on like what the business strategy was, but I was like, man, these guys are just making junk and selling it. Do you know much about that business?
They probably would have called it tchotchkes. Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it maybe there's some connection with the union because of the use of scrap metal and this type of stuff. But he was always, and these guys were hustlers. This is many people have like a very dichotomous view of what it means to be mafia related, that you're either Michael Corleone or you're not mob affiliated. But for every Michael Corleone, there's like 50 runners and hustlers and just street thugs that are not wealthy guys, but they're just trying to make a living. And I mean, the Ruby siblings, all of them are always like they had this business. They were later doing, I think one of them had a cleaners. They're just in these little businesses that may or may not have a little seed money and be doing some laundering to keep the lights on from time to time.
Sure. Yeah.
I certainly have seen it, in real life too. Like it's not far-fetched.
I mean, most shopping centers I go to in America, I mean, you never see anybody there. I assume everything's a money laundering front if I don't understand the business model personally.
Yep.
But anyway, so Ruby leaves the family business, and by the way, it's around this time that he changes his name for legally from Rubenstein to Ruby, and I think the rationale for that was that he thought he would have better opportunities just based on, people being anti-Semitic. Is that pretty much why he did it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I
Yeah.
think that's yeah.
So Ruby then he leaves the family business after a buyout and he moves to Dallas in 1947. We're going to come back to that in just a second, but I want to take a quick little detour and talk about this Richard Nixon, this whole sidebar on did Ruby know Richard Nixon from the House Un-American Activities Committee. Are you familiar with this controversy?
Yeah, I've become familiar with it.
So I don't know if you guys looked at this issue or not, but I dove into it, and the whole time I was like, I always thought this was a legit thing that, because it is a kind of a real document. It turns out that it's just much more likely that they're talking about another Jack Rubenstein who literally was a former communist, and it's during the HUAC, right? Like, what would Jack Ruby have on America? He's never been involved in anything that, just because he's involved in the unions doesn't mean he's a communist. So so anyway, that was where I landed, was that it's probably not the Jack Rubenstein that we know in that document.
Yeah, I found your analysis of the issue to be persuasive, and the junk handlers union that Ruby was involved in, and even the larger Teamsters scene with Jimmy Hoffa, they were anti-communist. They
Right.
were not really anywhere near the line of pro-communist unions.
Right. So there you go. So look, I know I got a couple emails from people asking me if I flip sides or whatever after that. But I'm on the side of the truth, friends. So here we go. Now here's what's interesting though. While I don't think he was a HUAC informant, it does appear that he was an informant for the Kefauver Committee. And that would make a lot more sense because that was a committee looking into organized crime. And where do I get this crazy idea? Well, it was in the New York Times. That's where I get it. From the New York Times, November 29th, 1963. A Chicago lawyer named Louis Kuttner told the New York Times that he sent Ruby to the committee council. So to me, why is he talking to the Kefauver committee if he doesn't know anything about organized crime? And this is also related to, there's also a conversation about Ruby being an FBI informant, which we're going to get to that here in a second. That's a little bit later down the list. Did you guys come across anything on the Kefauver side of things, or is it just that New York Times article pretty much?
Yeah, it didn't really come up in our series. I don't remember seeing that particular article, but yeah, it was interesting to see that he's on their radar. I mean, and of course it doesn't mean that he's anti-mob. I don't, that's like not necessarily what you need to take away from the fact that he was sent to talk to the committee.
Yes, and that's because a lot of times these informant relationships are blessed from the top of the mafia because you may feel like there's some level of immunity, or at least you'll know what they're going after, so you can kind of have an inside man.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about this move to Dallas. And so this is a big dispute point. Okay. So the things we talked about so far are not really disputed. There's really no dispute about the Al Capone envelopes, the moving out west with Roselli, the union stuff. None of this is disputed. Now we're getting into dispute land. So these are things where you can find, Fred Litwin and other folks would dispute this. Certainly, the Warren Commission disputes this, and
Or
that was
covers their eyes.
covers their eyes. Yeah, yeah, I would say so. So yeah, here's the scheme. So Chicago outfit representative Paul Roland Jones attempts to bribe Dallas Sheriff-elect Steve Guthrie, and this is in, I want to say, late 46, early 47, or right around there. And basically, he said, "Hey, look, the Chicago outfit's coming to Dallas. We're going to run a gambling operation here. I need you to not bust us, and we're going to give you 50% of the profits. We got this guy coming in from out of town who's from Chicago, who's going to run a restaurant and gambling front." And then Jones said that whoever this man is, he's not Jewish, and that yeah, basically the guy, or he said he wouldn't be Jewish or Italian, is what he said. Now this is in 22 of the 42 tapes. Okay, so we have two recordings that are the FBI reviews 22 tapes. I left out the headline. The sheriff finds out that he's getting bribed, and then he kind of does what he's supposed to do. He doesn't just take the money. He calls the police and calls the state law enforcement, and they set up a sting operation and they record everything. And so that's what's interesting about this is it is recorded, and there are all these records missing. 22 of 42, or there are 20 that were not listened to, and they say two were missing. This is based on the FBI report. So I wasn't able to get my head around, like, okay, so what happened to the other, 18 or whatever? You guys just didn't listen to them, or what? But anyway, what's interesting is Sheriff Guthrie comes forth and says that Ruby was repeatedly named by Jones. So he later says that. The official story is that Paul Roland Jones, the guy trying to bribe the sheriff, never mentioned Ruby. And not only did he not mention Ruby, he specifically said the guy wouldn't be Jewish. What do you want? Right. Um, and that is on one of the tapes. It's just we're missing all these other tapes. And the kicker is the headline. The sheriff himself says that Ruby was specifically mentioned repeatedly by Jones and that it would be on the tapes if they were to listen to it. And what he said was that Ruby was the one who's going to run a restaurant with gambling upstairs. Now, there's a guy, Lieutenant George Butler. He's the other person who's involved. He
Oh
doesn't,
boy.
he's not on the same side as Sheriff Guthrie. He basically denies that Ruby was ever mentioned, but there's some reason to have pause about George Butler's veracity, perhaps, and that is that Butler privately told a reporter that Ruby was involved in bribery attempts. In other words, he told a reporter the opposite of what he said to the FBI. He falsely claimed that Oswald was Ruby's illegitimate son. So he's just making up patently false things that no one says or believes. And when you do that, it just makes me think you're just trying to burn investigative resources or kind of put people on a different track. You want to get people off of the trail, right? So, but Lieutenant George Butler, falsely claimed that Ruby applied for a visa to Mexico with Oswald. So he's trying to associate Ruby with Oswald. And Butler appeared visibly nervous shortly before Oswald was brought to the basement. So there's a reporter who knew Butler well and said he's a cool customer. And right before Oswald comes out, he's shaking and his lips are trembling, like he knows something's going to happen. Highly speculative, but you throw all those things out there, it's like, geez, the only guy who comes against Guthrie kind of has some shady things going on. Now the counterpoint is people will say, you know, Guthrie was, it's just like the Ralph Yates thing. Guthrie was a big talker and no one believed him or whatever. They have like two or three character witnesses somewhere in the FBI reports to say that Guthrie was like not reliable or whatever. But why make all this up? I mean, he was the sheriff. Anyway, your thoughts on that whole scenario?
Yeah, I mean, as I understand the way that Guthrie came into the picture, he was a really relatively new sheriff at the time that this all went down, that there had kind of been a deal in place between the last big organized crime figure in Dallas, who was a guy by the name of Benny Binion, who moved out to Vegas around this time. And I think he's the founder of the World Series of Poker, kind of a colorful figure in the gambling world. But he departs the scene. The sheriff switches over to this fella Guthrie. He's kind of taking a cleaner approach and therefore, gets all these guys on tape, etc. And so it's not surprising to me that the other dirty cops, and I don't think Guthrie lasted that long in the role as sheriff after all of this. So it's not surprising that everybody would throw Guthrie under the bus to try to keep the gravy train rolling on the wheels of greasing the skids for the mob in Dallas. And as for Butler, I mean, yeah, he has zero credibility in my opinion, because he was the guy who the mob approached in the first place to try and get the meeting with Guthrie, because he was known to be, a guy with some friendliness to organized crime. And I totally agree with you. I think he was flooding the stream with a lot of horse pucky to make a lot of noise and just put smoke up in the air to distract and cause confusion, which is something that we see again and again with these figures with very suspicious connections around the scene, including, in the media in Dallas, in the Dallas Police Department, and Butler is definitely such a character.
So you and I look at this and we go, what do you want? The clean sort of outgroup sheriff Guthrie comes in and he's saying that it's Ruby, even though he has nothing to gain for from it at that time. And then the only person coming, that says that that's not the case is Butler. And as we just laid out, he's not credible. So the only argument remaining is, yaha, Butler is credible, and it's not on the tapes. That's the argument. But to me, you didn't look at all the tapes, and two of them are missing entirely. My inference point would be obviously that, well, I believe Sheriff Guthrie, and I think you too, but there are people who look at this same set of facts and would agree with us on the facts as laid out. Maybe they would disagree on some little slight things here and there. And they go, yeah, so what? It doesn't say Ruby. It's done. You know what I mean? So anyway.
Yeah. And as for the fact that Jones said that the man would not be Jewish or Italian, like, come on. He's talking to what he perceives as a Dallas good old boy
Right.
with presumed prejudice. He's like, don't worry, Guthrie. This isn't going to be a conspicuous thing. You're not going to get any egg on your face. It's not going to be a Jew. It's not going to be an Italian. This will be
Right.
a clean business here. Like, you just got to think about context with these statements and not take it so literally.
Right. So just to add a little to sprinkle some other little facts related to this, was Ruby the Chicago man in Dallas that Paul Roland Jones was talking about? Paul Roland Jones said that Ruby was vouched for by outfit figures. So in other words, the guy approaching the sheriff said Ruby was vouched for by Chicago outfit figures. He's probably referring to Jimmy Weinberg and Paul Needlenose Labiola, who both said that Ruby was, quote, all right. Ruby told he told Dallas businessman Giles Miller that he was directed to move to Dallas, which I think is a pretty major fact. Chuck Giancana, who knows if Sam Giancana's half brother is reliable or not, but according to him, he says Sam Giancana personally sent Ruby to Dallas. That's coming from Sam Giancana's brother. His close friends were Chicago outfit enforcers Dave Yaris and Lenny Patrick. So again, we're having this question is Ruby closely enough associated to the mafia that could have been what was behind him killing Oswald? Is really what we're getting at. And he doesn't have to be a made man, but he would need to have a lot of touch points and associations. What I just laid out to me sort of satisfies that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. And with respect to Paul Roland Jones, there's also some evidence that Paul Roland Jones, who was caught a few times for drug smuggling, particularly opium smuggling, And maybe this goes back to your trinkets business question. One of his schemes for smuggling opium was he had a metal pipes business, and he was stuffing the pipes with opium. And that was a joint venture that Eva Grant, Jack Ruby's sister, and Jack Ruby, and I think one of the other siblings too, had a cut on. And, of course, they denied they knew that drugs were involved, but of course they denied it. And these guys, Yaris and Patrick, you say enforcers, I think it's important for the listener to understand these guys were up to their eyeballs. Like they were actually killers.
Right.
And they were directly in the organizational structure of Sam Giancana in Chicago, where you have the Italian capo at the head of the organization, and then the neighborhoods are run by guys with the same ethnicity as the folks in the neighborhood. So Yaris and Patrick, whose real name was Leonard Levine, were both Jewish guys on the southwest side of Chicago in the neighborhood where they grew up with Jack Ruby. And I imagine that we'll hear their names again in a few minutes when we start to talk about the summer and fall of 1963.
Tell me more about what they were doing in the summer and fall of '63, because I don't know that I went that deep on Yaris and Patrick, and that may be an area where you may have more coverage.
Yeah, sure. So Yaris, Patrick, and Jones, and another name I'll throw into the mix from the same Chicago mob-connected milieu of these, Jewish kids who grow up to become real tough guys, uh, is Al Gruber, another name. So in the summer and fall of '63, they are in very regular contact with Ruby, in some cases after an apparent break, that they haven't talked to each other for a while, but they're making phone calls. And in November of '63, what's really interesting is that Al Gruber and Paul Roland Jones just both happen to find themselves in Dallas on, I think, the 11th and through the 13th. And they're meeting up with Jack Ruby at this time. And wouldn't you know it, their reasons for being in Dallas are insane. Like they make no sense unless it's to see Jack Ruby about something. Because what Jones says is, "Oh yeah, I was just passing through." Let me see, because let me just pull it up in my notes because I forget which one was where. But one of them said he was nearby Dallas because he was in Alabama, and the other one went by Dallas because he was in Joplin, Missouri. Now, if anybody has a map of the United States, those are
Right.
not exactly what you'd call a hop over when you're
Right.
driving. So I think we maybe mentioned how long of a drive it would have been, but they're suddenly in very constant contact with Jack Ruby. And, he mentions this even to the Warren Commission. He says, yeah, Al Gruber, he was a real bad guy when I knew him in Chicago. But then I saw him again recently and, oh, he's totally reformed now.
So when we get to the phone calls, some of those calls were to Yaris and Patrick and to Al Gruber.
hmm
Okay, got it.
Yeah, yeah. To Yaris and Patrick, he's calling them a lot, and Gruber and Jones, he actually is with them in person, in the
Sure, sure.
flesh, in
Okay.
Dallas in November, and Gruber has even more mob connections, again through the sort of Hoffa arm of the syndicate operations. He's working in a metal trading business, again, kind of similar to this trinkets type of stuff. Like I think he's selling cutlery or pots and pans or something like that, and some cover, right? But he finds himself in Dallas with Ruby, and there's really not any good reason for him being there. And the way that Ruby describes it to the Warren Commission is, he just happened to come through, and it was a social visit. And I promised to send him a dog. That was
Okay.
one of Ruby's things. He liked to breed dachshunds and give them away to people.
Here, take care of this. You'll enjoy it. Here's a new responsibility. So we have all those relationships, but hey, maybe they're just relationships. But the thing is, we're not, as you just laid out, and as we'll get to here in a second, we're not just saying these are people he knew throughout his life. We're saying that these people were talking to him. He was talking to them before, and two of them visited him in person. So, anyway, Dallas, the nightclub. I want to talk about the Carousel Club and who really owned it. His silent partner was Ralph Paul, and then Paul owned 50% of the Carousel stock, but he never received any profits. He never received any distributions, and he didn't know who owned the other 50%. And the source of Paul's money that he contributed was unknown. I mean, he owned like a drive-through, or no, a drive-in, I think, a restaurant. But he wasn't like independently super wealthy. And Ruby's clubs consistently lost money, but somehow stayed open. So this is again one of these inference things where it's like, let's look at what's really going on, but there's not like a lot of great hard documentation around this. But isn't it kind of strange that we don't know who owns the thing or where the money's going?
It is strange. And reportedly there's gambling going on in the clubs, off books type of transactions that might be beyond what's reported in the club's income. And there's also some indications that Ruby was selling pornography out of the club as well. And I think he was pretty adamant that he did not allow any prostitution on the premises. But when you have a establishment of the sort that the Carousel Club was, you never know if perhaps off the premises there's also some hanky-panky going on.
Sure. Yeah. So aside from the ownership of the club, Ruby was arrested 9 times when he was in Dallas between 1947 and 1963. 9 arrests. And the charges included assault and pistol whipping an officer. But the worst thing he ever got was a small fine, and he never did any jail time. Yes, he was close with the Dallas police, and he knew a lot of them, and he let them come to the club and would give them free drinks and stuff. And you could really argue, I think you really could argue that he just wanted to be in the good graces of the cops as a nightclub owner and as somebody who may need them because it's the nature of the business is you could get some drunk patrons who would be a problem pretty easily. So that's sort of the official story argument people make. But 9 arrests, man, that's a lot. Just one more thing. It's like, do you believe it or not? And it's not like there's a clear smoking gun document, but it's certainly sus, as the kids say, to me.
Yeah, that's a lot of arrests. And I mean, especially the pistol whipping a police officer, that the cops are not too fond of people that beat up their own. So, uh,
Yeah, yeah. Usually that could get you a little bit of time. All right, let's pivot to gun running. So to me, I'm trying to figure out where to place this because, when you say this person is running guns, you kind of think more of like international, weapons dealer type person, or you think maybe like the CIA. You don't necessarily think mafia, but that might just be me, how I'm sort of thinking about it. We've got all these instances that I'll go through of proof, I would say, that Ruby was running guns. I don't know if we know precisely who he was getting the guns from, although maybe there's a clue in the form of Thomas Eli Davis, who was known by the CIA. But before I get to I guess let me go through the list first, and then I'll toss to you for you can chime in on the gun running. So okay, number one, James Beard saw Ruby storing weapons in Kima, Texas, and those weapons were then transported to Mexico and delivered to Castro via his personal boat. Ruby's involved in actually transferring the weapons. So that's come from it. There's an FBI report with James Beard. There's a pilot named Blaney Mac Johnson who identified Ruby as arranging flights to smuggle weapons. Then there's this woman named Mary Woodard. There's an FBI report from her and her daughter. And her brother, Mary Woodard's brother, this guy James Woodard, he used to know Ruby in Dallas. He was a cop in Dallas, and he met Ruby there. Then he moved to Isla Mirada, Florida. Well, his sister Mary is visiting him, and while she's there visiting him, she meets this guy who his name is Jack. He was observed with a trunk full of weapons by Mary. And then Mary's daughter's husband was hanging out with James Woodard when he was drinking one night, and he sort of spilled the beans that yeah, we're running guns to Cuba, me and Jack. And then, of course, when Mary and her daughter Dolores saw Ruby on TV shooting Oswald, both of them said it was the same Jack Ruby that they saw in Isla Mirada, Florida. So then we have Robert McEwen, and McEwen, this is the same guy who an Oswald lookalike, maybe Oswald himself, visited trying to buy weapons. McEwen kind of got fame for being friends with Castro because the CIA was playing both sides for a period of time and was running guns to Castro before and during the revolution. Anyway, so McEwen operated near Kima, Texas, during Ruby's alleged gun smuggling activity. That's kind of how he got to know what Ruby was up to. He was over in Baytown. And Ruby contacted McEwen in 1959 seeking help with Cuban detainees, later attempted to obtain an introduction to Fidel Castro, but didn't follow up. And of course, after the assassination, McEwen identifies this man as Jack Ruby. And I went into detail in the episode of, he says his name's Rubenstein, right? There's a lot of clues that give away who it is. And then he identifies it as Ruby. And then we have these admissions from Ruby. He warned his attorney, Tom Howard, about exposure he may have from running guns. He named a man named Davis as a gun running associate, and the CIA knew Thomas Eli Davis III as an anti-Castro arms trainer. Ruby's psychiatrist, Dr. Warner Tudor, noted that Ruby basically was guilty about sending guns to Cuba because he thought he was helping communists. And retired Cuban General Fabian Escalante confirmed Ruby's gun running role. So to me, all the what I just laid out makes it clear to me that he was involved in running guns. One more thing to doubt that he's just a lone nut, because man, that wasn't really part of the story at all that the Warren Commission told. My question to you is that also your assessment? And on whose behalf do you think he was running those guns?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's the guns and the Jeeps that they're kind of confused, they kind of mix together. Some people talk about running guns, some people talk about running Jeeps, some people talk about both. I think that there is enough there that it's highly likely to have happened. Um, with respect to the reactions of everybody involved, and especially Ruby's statements, which are, on the record to his lawyers, that that was kind of the biggest concern that he had after he got arrested was that the Cuba stuff was going to get out. And he was very concerned about this. It's also, we'll talk about Jolly West later, but there's also a line in some draft documents that my friend Max Arvo, who we had in our series, found in the Jolly West archives, that there's a line about Jack Ruby having concerns about his and regrets about his Cuban activities. And Jolly West put a red line through that sentence in this draft document to keep it out of the public record. So just again, and we see this time and time again in JFK research, wherever people are taking extra pains to keep something out of the public record, that is definitely a red flag from my point of view. And Ruby's Cuban activities are certainly up there. And I think also it's, I always pronounced it McKeown, but maybe McEwen is the how he pronounced it. But he was interviewed by the British researcher Anthony Summers and told him, that Jack Ruby was a mob guy, and he got real nervous when he was asked about the Cuban operations, but essentially admitted to being involved in it. So I think that there's multiple independent sources plus the real anxiety and desire to cover it up, that to me pushes it over the line into something that very likely happened. And I'm not the only person that thinks that. Bert Griffin and his partner in the Warren
Hubert.
Commission, Hubert, yeah, Leon Hubert or Hubert, uh, were also concerned about this, and they wrote about it in their March of '64 memo to Lee Rankin, where they set out all of these loose ends that they feel had not been adequately addressed
Yeah,
in their investigation of Jack Ruby, but yet the commission never interviewed McKeown.
exactly. Exactly. And I pronounced the name that same way. And then I found the his HSCA testimony is available. It's actually as a full podcast that Lone Gunman put out a while ago. It's on their feed. And in that testimony, he says his name is McEwen. And I'm like, oh wow, I never would have thought that. That's what a weird way to say your name. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, if you go back and listen to any of the things when I was in Louisiana, I got pretty much every single pronunciation wrong. When I had a chance, I chose the wrong one, but that's okay. So all right, let's move on to Ruby as an FBI informant. So this is not disputed. This is absolutely the case. Ruby contacted the FBI on 8 occasions between March and October of 1959. He was approached by the FBI to become an informant because they thought he may have knowledge of criminal elements in Dallas due to his nightclub ownership. It's probably likely that Ruby didn't just go and do this on his own. Although if your position is Ruby had no relationships with the mafia whatsoever and would have nothing to worry about being an informant, he wouldn't have to worry about betraying anyone's trust because he didn't even know anyone in the mafia. If that's your position, then okay, whatever. But the point is, as you brought up earlier, the mere fact of him being an informant doesn't mean, oh, look at this guy, he's two-faced, he's turning. That may have been an approved informant relationship. Now, the most interesting thing to me about this, because again, like the fact of him being an informant, I'll actually buy it, even though to me I kind of once you know something you can't unknow it. But if you see this alone, I get it. I get why you would think that this is kind of a nothing burger. So my question then is, why did the Warren report not mention it at all? It seems like they should have mentioned it if it was a nothing burger.
Yeah, I think that the FBI didn't have a lot of substance that they received from Ruby's various trips to go and talk to them.
Right.
But um, again, that almost suggests that maybe he did have an agenda and that the FBI just wasn't buying it for whatever reason,
Sure.
that they weren't buying what he was selling.
Right. Louis McWillie. Let's talk about McWillie. He was Ruby's closest mob connection, most likely, although he had so many. But I say that because McWillie himself told the HSCA that he was one of Ruby's closest friends. That's, not nothing. So, uh,
Yet Ruby told the Warren Commission, I idolized McWillie. He is a pretty nice boy, and I happened to be idolizing him. So doesn't get much clearer than that.
all right. And so if you're someone who you go, hey, I've heard what you guys have said so far. You don't know anything else about Ruby's relationship with the mafia. You're like, look, I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence. What else do you have? Well, check this out. So you just laid out what Ruby said about him. McWillie said he's one of Ruby's closest friends. So who is McWillie? Well, he's a world-class gambler tied to Meyer Lansky and Johnny Roselli and many others. He worked in Cuban casinos for Lansky in the 30s and 40s. And then he met Ruby. He moved to Dallas and he was operating some illegal gambling clubs there in Dallas for a few years in the 50s. That's where he met Ruby and they became close. McWillie later he went back to Cuba and he worked at Santos Traficante controlled casinos in Cuba. Then in 1961, Johnny Roselli, sent Louis McWillie, Jack Ruby's best friend, according or one of his closest friends, according to McWillie. He sent him to go monitor Frank Sinatra at the Cal Neva Lodge on behalf of Sam Giancana. So again, they asked this guy, they go, look, I want you to keep an eye on Sinatra on behalf of the big boss. You think he's just nobody? And you think Ruby's just incidental? He's friends with this guy? Like, goodness. Anyway, so McWillie later worked at mob connected casinos in Las Vegas after that. So that's overwhelming to me, but I understand that there are people who look at that and they go, so what? But anyway, your thoughts?
I just wonder what could make a person ask so what about all of that. Like, Roselli, Giancana, Meyer Lansky. These are the top members of organized crime who are connected to the CIA directly in the operations to assassinate Castro. Like these aren't random people. These aren't just, criminals or crooks of some random stripe. These are the guys. And McWillie is clearly loyal to them and beholden to them as his entire career trajectory. We're talking about 30-year period here, from the 30s all the way into the 60s. It's overwhelming evidence, like you said. I just don't see how it leaves a shadow of a doubt. And the fact that Jack Ruby is idolizing him and is, well, as we'll talk about, going to visit him in various places throughout the world, it's just a lot of very, very hard evidence in the Jack Ruby is a mob guy story.
I think so. All right, so let's continue down that road. So we talked about McWillie. I want to talk specifically about the 1959 Ruby Cuba trip where he went to go see McWillie. So he traveled to Havana in August and September of 1959. The trip was arranged and paid for by McWillie. Ruby stayed in Cuba for 8 to 10 days, according to him, but documents show that the trip was really closer to a month and that he likely left to go to Miami and then came back. So I wonder, what that little side trip was about. The Warren report acknowledged the existence of the trip, which good for, honestly, good for them to acknowledge something even happened. but they labeled it purely social. So he just went to go see this guy who we described as being this uber connected mob guy, and he's my buddy. And yeah, I don't like the beach, and I don't like gambling, is what Ruby said. So I don't even like gambling. Hilarious. And then we're supposed to believe that he just goes to Cuba for fun then on this fun trip. And when is it that he goes? Just a few months after Castro took over. That's all. Like, it's not like it's going to be this great, problem-free visit, I would imagine. So anyway, McWillie was the pit boss at the Trafficante-controlled Riviera Casino. And the Warren Commission staff never investigated any rumors of any illegal activities in Cuba. So they just said, yeah, he went there. And so a lot of what I'm covering is from the HSCA's dig into this. Before we get to this Santos Trafficante and did Ruby visit Trafficante, you mentioned that he went to several places. You want to unpack any other travel that Ruby may have done with McWillie and anything on the Cuba trip aside from the prison?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I specifically was considering his November
Oh,
17th trip to Vegas.
yes. Okay, sure. Oh, and McWillie was there.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yes. Okay. Gotcha. On the Cuba side of things, is that HSCA said 8 to 10 days, but I believe the pass something, I don't know if there was the passport or some of the travel documents made it look like it was a longer trip. Anything you think that's important about that trip that I haven't mentioned yet?
Not really. No, I think that the trip is another example, first of all, like you mentioned, of Ruby just lying about stuff. If you read all of his testimony and statements and reported statements, like he and his siblings too, they're lying all the time and they're not any good at it. They tie themselves into circles. They tie themselves into knots. They contradict themselves constantly. And this is just one of so many examples as you read through this stuff that, like, how can you take any significance from a denial of Jack Ruby about the significance of his Cuba trip when he's making these blatantly false statements? Or another thing he said, I think, about the trip was, yeah, I left because I didn't speak Spanish. And it's like, you are in the US mafia controlled casino. This has been a playground for Americans for the greater part of 30 years by this point, since the mob went down to Havana and put down their shop. So it's not believable what he's saying on just the slightest of inspection. It falls apart like a house of cards.
Sure, sure. So let's pivot over to the Santos Trafficante prison visit. So Trafficante, we've talked about him a lot on Solving JFK. He was imprisoned by Fidel Castro at Trescornia prison in June of 1959. And I found conflicting information about why he was put in jail. Some was that he had worked with Batista, Castro, Castro's predecessor, just basically that he wasn't loyal to Castro, and some of it was that he was trafficking drugs, and that's why he was put in jail. I learned in the recap and rebuttals with Lou Ferrante, and you may already know this, that Trafficante continued to traffic heroin and other drugs from Cuba even after Castro was in power, and that Trafficante had a backdoor deal with Castro. Did you know that?
Yeah, I had heard that. And, it's another one of these things that people think very black and white about historical issues that really have a lot more nuance to them. When Castro first took power, and this kind of connects with Ruby's gun running and Jeep running, the CIA itself, which later became Castro's biggest enemy and would-be assassin, was trying to get friendly with Castro.
Right.
And it's not only Jack Ruby doing this stuff, but in I think some of the interesting things from the Mary Haverstick book, A Woman I Know, that she's talking about these female pilots that got real friendly with Castro in the lead up to and around the time of the Cuban Revolution, who were also trafficking aircraft and other weapons to Castro for both espionage reasons and to ingratiate the CIA and the Americans to him. So that tracks for sure.
Yeah, the CIA was just looking for some moderate rebels, probably. So anyway,
Ain't nothing new under the sun.
amen. Trescornia, it's pretty nice. It's prison. It's like a minimum security detention facility. But the question is, and kind of what's been put forth in a lot of the conspiracy literature, is that Ruby was sent to Cuba to get Trafficante out of jail. And there is some conversation where Ruby's talking about the person who visits McEwen, that was Ruby, is talking about trying to get three people out of prison in Cuba, but that's in January and February of '59. It doesn't line up with when Trafficante is in prison. So even though I wanted to make that puzzle piece fit, it doesn't. But there's a separate question of, did Ruby visit Trafficante in prison? And that one, while I didn't land on yes, he definitely did, the official story itself is maybe. So the official story is maybe after reading the HSCA. So Louis McWillie admits to, remember, Ruby, he's staying with McWillie in Cuba. And McWillie goes to visit Trescornia, and while he's there, he sees Trafficante. He says he saw him one or two times while he was there. And he also, McWillie, told the HSCA that it was possible that Ruby went with him. So there you go. British journalist John William Hudson said that Ruby visited Trafficante in prison. And, of course, Trafficante then denied that when he spoke to the HSCA. But it is possible because Ruby's travel dates overlapped with when Trafficante was in prison. So we don't have proof that Ruby bailed Trafficante out, but it's a coin toss as to whether or not he physically went with McWillie to visit Trafficante in prison. I don't know why Hudson would make that up, but you don't really need this to prove anything, but it's just one more cherry on top.
Yeah. And I think there would be significance for a mere visit, even if it's not like getting him out, because Trafficante is presumably still running his empire. Like, this is a guy with a lot going on in Florida. He's got to keep, as anytime anybody who's seen their fair share of mafia movies knows, like if one guy is vulnerable, a lot of sharks are going to circle around and try to take his stuff. So whatever the case may be, if it's to get him out or to just visit and convey a message or whatever the purpose, if there was that visit, which there's enough there, especially the McWillie angle, because McWillie, I think it's pretty clear that he was contacting Trafficante while Trafficante was incarcerated, and by innuendo, like that, given the closeness of Ruby and McWillie, and Ruby is with McWillie on this trip, like whatever McWillie is up to, Ruby is going to tag along. That's his
Right.
idol, for God's sakes. So it seems reasonably likely that they met up, and whatever the purpose of it was, it's not they're not planning a bake sale.
McWillie told the HSCA that he knew that they asked, "Well, did you know Trafficante?" And he said, "Well, if he would see me in public, he would say hello to me and say my name and come shake my hand, but I didn't know him."
Such a classic mob response.
Anyway, so okay, let's pivot on to Ruby's ties to Carlos Marcello's organization. So now we're getting into the mechanics of if Ruby did the hit on behalf of the mafia, what does that look like, and through whom? Well, who would have relayed that information or that assignment, as it were. So Dallas was within Carlos Marcello's territory. He was the Louisiana boss, but he also had Dallas, or I'm sorry, he also had Texas. Uh, in Dallas, he had two underbosses, Joe Savello and Joe Campisi. And there's our witnesses, informants that talked about Ruby's closeness with Savello, but he also spent extensive time with Campisi, especially at the Egyptian Lounge, the restaurant, which is still there on Mockingbird Lane today. And I visited there, and it's pretty good, a little pricey, but pretty awesome that it's still there and still in business. Anyway, he was at Campisi's the night before the Kennedy assassination. Ruby's roommate testified that Campisi was one of Ruby's three closest friends. And guess what? The first person to visit Ruby in jail after Oswald was killed by Ruby was Campisi. Ruby also knew Carlos Marcello's brothers because they operated the Jefferson Music Company that was a legitimate business interest of his, selling mostly jukeboxes for the most part. That's what it was. They also did, I want to say, pool billiards as well. Another point is that Marcello may have had control of the Carousel Club. So this all comes from the Jack Van Lanningham audio recordings, the CAMTEX operation. Are you hip to CAMTEX? Did you guys cover that on yours?
No, we didn't. Not nearly. I don't think we covered it at all, actually.
All right, so let's touch on that for just a little bit. So Marcello goes to prison, and the thing he goes to prison for is a lab. I forget the exact details of it, but it's some mafia racketeering stuff. He ends up in prison. And while he's there, the feds start to think that, is this guy still running his business? Is he still, being the boss while he's in prison? And to find that out, they realized there was this guy named Jack Van Lanningham who befriended Marcello organically. Like they actually became friends. Then the prison warden approached Van Lanningham to see if he'd be willing to work with the FBI. Then the warden called the FBI. It's like, how funny, just on the personal level. So this whole thing, this whole Camtex operation, and then this Carlos Marcello conversation, maybe proof that Marcello confessed to it. Now, did he actually do it is a different conversation, but it all happened because there's some prison warden going, I'm gonna call the FBI. They're gonna love this. Oh man, I might get a might get a promotion. It's just interesting. Because it all came from the warden. But anyway, the FBI did in fact they moved Van Lanningham into Marcello's cell, and then they bugged everything, and they had lots of hours of tape recordings, which are still in the National Archives allegedly, or in the FBI archives, and we still don't have access to them. And here's the headline: Marcello told Van Lanningham that his organization controlled the Carousel Club, and he said that Ruby was just the manager. He also said that Ruby had been stealing money from him, and that he summoned Ruby to Louisiana to Churchill Farms to confront him about the theft, and then Ruby begged for his life. Now, there's a suggestion, sort of an implied suggestion, that Ruby owed a favor, and that favor that was, called in was for Ruby to kill Oswald. So, the big takeaway here is we got to get those Camtex records. So if I do have a chance to talk to Luna or whoever, I want all the records, but it's ridiculous we don't have the Camtex records. That's whether or not what he's saying is true is a debated thing, but we should at least be able to hear what he said. You know what I mean?
For sure. For sure. Low
So
hanging fruit.
low hanging fruit. Marcello goes on to say that he ordered the hit, But as you know, and look, I'm in a weird thing because I go so deep on the topic I'm on, like so deep. But then like I don't even look at the other topics until I get to them. So so I have like these big blind spots. But the point is, in the case, just because Marcello says that he did it, he made that could be like subjectively true in his mind, and there's a lot of other things happening at the same time. So like, did he fund the exiles after Kennedy stopped funding them because he wanted them to stop? Yes. Was he tight with Ferry, who was tight with all these Cuban exiles? Yeah, it's a complicated mess, is the point, because everyone's all working together.
Right. And sometimes they're working together at cross purposes. Like it's not always, definitely not always a smooth operation, and they don't always gel when uh, they cross streams on occasion.
Let's get to those pre-assassination phone calls. There's a whole thing of a whole body of evidence conversation about, did Ruby suddenly start having way more long distance phone calls close to the assassination? And the HSCA did a deep dive on this, and what they found was troubling, I would say. So his call volume did increase dramatically in October and then even more in November of 1963. He was averaging about 40 long distance calls a month, and then it jumped up to 85 in October. And then in the first 3 weeks of November, it was 115 calls. So the mere increase in calls alone, I would say, is suspicious, is worth looking into, but that doesn't prove anything. So what are we talking about here? Who's he calling? So the answer is he's calling Mafia guys and also Union guys because there's a big overlap, turns out. So he called Ralph Paul frequently, sometimes 5 times a day. He started to call Louis McWillie with increased frequency. He called Irwin Weiner, a major Midwest mafia financier who refused to cooperate with the FBI after the assassination. He called Marcello Lieutenant Nofio Pecora, even though that was a short call. I think he was really trying to call Marcello associate Harold Tannenbaum. So like, oh, sorry, wrong Marcello guy. Let me talk to the other Marcello guy I was trying to call. He called Hoffa Associates Barney Baker and Dusty Miller, and he called Carlos Marcello operative Frank Caracci and Marcello's brother Pete Marcello on multiple occasions. So it doesn't look great. Now, the counterpoint is, hey, this is nothing because Ruby actually had a beef with the union, specifically the American Guild of Variety Artists, AGVA, and he's trying to call all these people frantically to get help with his union problem. That's what's going on. And so there's a grain of truth to that argument. There's another guy that operated a strip club in Dallas, and he successfully was able to pull off having amateur nights to have amateur dancers so that he didn't have to pay the union wages to the professional dancers.
Oh
And
yeah, Weinstein's, I think.
Weinstein, yeah. So Ruby basically was mad that he couldn't replicate what Weinstein was doing because he couldn't find any he wasn't able to recruit any amateurs at his club. So he wanted the Guild of Variety Artists to either enforce against Weinstein for, breaking the rules, or to make it totally illegal to do, and make it clear that you can't have amateur dancers. That's the issue that he was all up in arms about. And he did make some calls on that. But the problem is the HSCA zoomed in to the 115 calls in November. Only 10 of them were for AGVA. So the other 105, which is an increase from the 40 in October, were not. So the union dispute alone does not account for this massive increase in calls. Your thoughts on the whole calls uh, dispute?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that the union, I think it's a convenient cover story and one that is, like you said, it's a real issue that he was actually facing. And it ties in too with the fact that at this time, he's in a great deal of debt and he owed something like the equivalent of almost $500,000 in today's, adjusted for inflation dollars to the IRS alone, not to mention any other debts that he might have had, including intangible debts of the sort that you discussed to Marcello. So, and I also would add, besides the names that you mentioned, well, to drill down a little bit, Barney Barker, this is Jimmy Hoffa's main enforcer. This was a 370-pound guy who's always at Hoffa's right hand and, allegedly committed murders for Hoffa. And Barker, at this same period of time, was talking to Dave Yaris, Ruby's old pal. Ruby also had made calls to Dave Yaris in addition to the folks that you mentioned. And he also talked to Lenny Patrick, who is another guy who allegedly committed murders for Jimmy Hoffa. So yes, it's true these guys have some generic connections to the union scene because they're all in the Hoffa orbit. But at the same time, not all of the people that he called have any connection. Like another is a mob connected professional gambler called Frank Goldstein, who Ruby knew and allegedly hadn't talked to for 20 years before November of 1963, and just decides to ring him up and see, hey, Frank Goldstein, how's professional gambling treating you? Uh, so that amidst these visits from Jones and from Gruber, he's also calling a woman who I don't think her name has come up yet, Candy Barr, another one of these sort of mob adjacent ladies. She was a longtime girlfriend of the LA mob figure Mickey Cohen, who had been a friend of Ruby's for a while since she was dancing in Dallas. She was also an exotic dancer before she got locked up for marijuana possession by Judge Joe Brown,
Ah,
represented by Melvin Belli. Uh,
geez.
but there's way too much for these all to be related to the AGVA issue, because also just think about it practically. If you have this issue with the union, how many phone calls are you really like? What's going to move the needle for you?
Right.
If 115 calls,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a big, and I think that there's even an anecdote that Bobby Kennedy saw the list of Jack Ruby's phone calls and said, "My God, these are all the names these are all the names on my list from his days in the Kefauver Commission, enforcing the law against organized crime."
That's it's wild. So one thing you just said uh, is really important that I did not bring up in the episodes. Candy Barr, whose boyfriend was Mickey Cohen, was he the boss at the time in LA?
Yeah, he was the kind of the Lansky
Right.
um associated operational boss over there.
So she gets in trouble for weed, and her lawyer is Melvin Belli,
Hmm.
who later would be Ruby's lawyer. So I was again back to my conversation with Lou Ferrante. He was giving an anecdote and he was saying one way you can tell if people are associated is if they have the same lawyer. That's a dead giveaway. So if you want to make it look like you're not affiliated with someone, you got to make sure you have different lawyers. So I mean, that's
Well, there you go.
something that I think is sort of common sense, but yes, that wow, that is something. Maybe it's a coincidence, Don. Could be a coincidence. Let's see.
Well, yeah, she was also another recipient of a dog from Jack Ruby. When she was on house arrest, he brought her some puppies.
It's
He's a
nice.
nice guy. Come on, he did it for Jackie. He's a nice guy. He's giving dogs away.
He doesn't want her to have to deal with the trial. We'll get to that. Let's talk about something. I This is a whole new thing that I didn't know about at all until going deep on Jack Ruby. The alleged trip to Las Vegas, November 16th to 17th of 1963, that weekend. So this is the weekend before the assassination. There are several FBI reports from about 10 people or so that placed Ruby at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas days before the assassination. Multiple informants said that Ruby was hosted by part owner of the Tropicana, Preston Feinberg, one of the hotel employees who personally handled Ruby's phone bill when it was over. That's one of the people who said that Ruby was there. There are also the hotel records from Ruby's stay later disappeared, And he was seen playing golf with Feinberg, and he even gave his card to someone. That was how they remembered Jack Ruby. Of course, Feinberg denied ever meeting with Ruby. And what's really interesting about this whole trip is that Ruby, what you alluded to, Ruby owed about $44,000 in 1963 money, which is close to $500,000 today, to the IRS. But when he came back from Las Vegas, or let's just say the Tuesday after that weekend, he told his tax attorney that he had a new source of money to pay the IRS debt. This is days before Kennedy's assassinated. Um, to me, there's so many FBI reports on it. This would have been something before. If you just told me this, I'd be like, that's crazy. No one ever talks about that. More people would talk about it if it was a thing, but I'm putting this in the I think it's a thing category. What about you?
Oh, it's definitely a thing. And I think he was also reportedly with Lou McWillie at the Thunderbird Hotel. That's another Lansky affiliated property where McWillie was working at that time. By this time, McWillie was out of Cuba, as was the rest of the mob, obviously, in November of 63. And he was set up there running the floor at the Thunderbird for Lansky and meets with Ruby again on the 17th of November, less than a week before the hit and 2 days before he comes back with his payday.
So it's kind of all, I mean, there's a straight line for all this, if to me. But let's talk about, so we've talked about so far Ruby's life leading up to the act of him killing Oswald. Let's talk about afterwards and the whole Jolly West angle and some of Ruby's confessions. That's kind of all we have left on the docket. I guess the prerequisite for that is a quick introduction of MKUltra generally. Do you want to touch on MKUltra? I know you've done probably more work on this than I have.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think maybe your listeners have a generic familiarity. So I won't, I could probably spend an hour, but
No, Crosby.
I'll keep it to my short list of the most overlooked or misunderstood things about MK Ultra. So it was, of course, a CIA project, or actually it consisted of something like 180 sub-projects to control human behavior and to understand different ways of manipulation of human behavior. It was not the first CIA intervention in this field of study. It took form after there'd already been Project Bluebird that was launched in response to the allegedly phony confessions of Cardinal Mindszenty in Hungary, to the communist authorities in Hungary, that the CIA thought that this guy definitely was brainwashed, and this is where the word kind of enters the lexicon. And after that was artichoke, named after Alan Dulles' favorite vegetable. Actually, apparently that's what it was. That's how it got its name. And then MK Ultra is kind of both of those on huge amounts of steroids. It was at the time the largest project of the CIA up till that point. Starts in the early 50s. It is spread across the entire United States through a massive, massive network of private front organizations. So it's not like the CIA goes up and hires these people and says, hey, you're working for the CIA. Now go and torture some people and see how they react. They're setting up these fronts all over the country. They're buying wings of hospitals from places like Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where the CIA financed the construction of an entire wing of the hospital on the condition that they have access to it to run tests on unwitting human subjects. And it's, one of the things under study was, of course, the use of LSD and other hallucinogens, but that wasn't it. There was also hypnosis, there was also stress and sleep deprivation and all kinds of various, both involving drugs, involving, what we would recognize as torture and other techniques. And many of them we don't know about at all because Dick Helms ordered the files to be destroyed in 1973. Dick Helms, the same Dick Helms who was one of the CIA's liaisons to the Warren Commission during the investigation of the Kennedy assassination, who was rewarded for his service by being elevated to the directorship of the agency. So it's a vast project, and it's one that, there's this saying, every accusation is a confession. I think MKUltra is an encapsulation of that principle where the CIA is pointing the finger at the communists for doing these types of experiments allegedly, which there's to this day not any evidence that either the Soviet Union nor the Chinese Communist Party had anything like the scale of operations that MKUltra did. Meanwhile, of course, the CIA is employing not only, your born corn-fed American psychopaths like Jolly West, but also Nazis and members of Japan's Unit 731. These are our enemies from World War II who were brought over under secret cover through Operation Paperclip and other similar projects to brain drain from fascism and to put those nefarious skills to use on behalf of Uncle Sam in one of the darkest chapters of our country's history that is, even to this day, so deeply covered up that it's shameful that it's not more common knowledge.
Right. And it was exposed in 1974 by Seymour Hersh in the New York Times. And remember, everybody, the vast majority of MK Ultra files were destroyed in 1973. So the absence of a file means nothing. It was probably destroyed, right? So, um, let's talk about Jolly West and how he fits into that. So he was a practitioner of MK Ultra. His claim to fame was after the Korean War, there were some POWs who admitted to basically using illegal weapons like biological weapons. I believe it was in Korea,
Yep.
and the
Chemical and germ warfare. Yeah.
the official story remains that those people were just cray and they were just had been brainwashed to say that. There is it's disputed as to whether or not that may be true that we actually did do those things. Do you know? Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, I would really direct listeners to the work of Jeffrey Kay. He's
Sure.
a psychologist who has a Substack called Hidden Histories, and we had him on the pod. We actually didn't talk about this issue, but we talked about the psychiatrists that the Warren Commission hired for kind of mysterious and really unclear purposes. But he's done an immense amount of work on this, has looked at archival sources from all of the countries involved, and has really run it to ground. And I find his work to very persuasively make the case that indeed the US did engage in chemical and biological warfare in Korea, and that, some of these confessions were sincere confessions by the airmen.
Sure. Well, and I agree. The Jeffrey K episode you guys did was great. Definitely check out his work. But Jolly West gains his notoriety within the CIA for successfully deprogramming these Korean War POWs to make them say, "No, we didn't really do that." Then they just made us say it, right? So that kind of got him on Sidney Gottlieb's radar, and there's sort of the lore of it all. But let's talk about what we have, which is we have letters from Sidney Gottlieb under his alias, which I mentioned in the episode, but I forget off the top of my head, to Jolly West, encouraging him in his MK Ultra project. And specifically, there's one where West lets him know, "Hey, I'm going to take this job at the University of Oklahoma." Which, by the way, let me just say quickly, rebuttal. I called it Oklahoma University because the football team's called OU. But apparently it's the University of Oklahoma, even though they call themselves OU, which is nonsensical. But University of Oklahoma is where Jolly West went. Anyway, the point is, if he's just somebody who doesn't matter, then why is he writing to the head of the CIA's Technical Services Division, Sidney Gottlieb, going, "Hey, you're good with me moving to Oklahoma and taking this job to head the psychiatry department?" Also, when he's in Oklahoma, he works on this elephant named Tusco. I forget what zoo, Oklahoma City Zoo. He ends up he gives the elephant LSD because that's what you do. You give elephants LSD just for fun. And he kills the elephant. And it turns out that the bill for the dead elephant, the elephant damages, were paid by none other than the CIA. But, so to me, that proves that as late as 1962, Jolly West is in fact working for the CIA because they're paying for the elephant that he killed. And what West did was he specialized in inducing psychosis and memory disruption. So before we get to West's involvement with Jack Ruby, anything else you want to talk on Jolly West specifically?
Just a guy with a resume a mile long in terms of nefarious deeds, and any sort of issue in post-war American history that has an asterisk next to it by us conspiracy heads, he probably put his fingers on. He was involved in Sirhan Sirhan case for the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. He was involved in Patty Hearst trial, and he was involved later in the Timothy McVeigh treat quote unquote treatment. And everybody he treats, none of them get better, which here's one of the guys recognized as one of the most successful psychiatrists of all time, and yet, his patients, they're not recovering from their ailments. They seem to just be getting worse.
Yeah, that's and he also the whole thing with Charles Manson, that was Jolly West was involved with that, which is
Right.
outlined in Tom O'Neill's book.
Yeah, he was setting up shop in the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic that he used as a recruitment ground, again, for these unwitting test subjects in experimentation involving drugs, and consistently lied about all of this stuff. I think that's another thing about Jolly West, that you compare what he said about his career versus what the documentary record actually shows. And the guy is constantly telling mistruths about what he's been up to.
Right.
And it even goes to his areas of study that he will downplay, the hypnosis aspect, when he's got so many publications under his authorship about precisely inducing behaviors through hypnosis and the combination of hypnosis and drugs. So he's a real expert in the field, both in the field of medicine, in the field of devious psychiatry, and in the field of mendacity.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about how Jolly West gets involved in Jack Ruby's case. And there's a rebuttal on this, so we're going to get deep in the details of this here in just a moment. But basically, our position is that West did attempt to insert himself into Ruby's case early. And when he did that, Judge Joe B. Brown rejected his involvement initially. And then Jolly West later joined the defense team via the new attorney, Hubert Smith, who I should mention was a medical consultant to the first group of attorneys. So it's not like he's totally an outsider. He's sort of a different player on the same team who takes the lead. But at any rate, it was under Hubert Smith that he brought in Ruby. So here's the kicker. There are 6 psychiatrists that saw Ruby before Jolly West. And every one of them said that basically his mental state was, that he was not insane. And when Jolly West visits Ruby on April 26, 1964, he declares that Ruby suffered an acute psychotic break immediately after seeing him. All the doctors who saw him afterwards agreed that he had suffered a psychotic break. And the judge, Joe Brown, expressed concern over this sudden change in Ruby, and he actually brought in another doctor to look at it. And that doctor said, "No, there's no problems here. Everything looks on the up and up, except for the possibility that he was poisoned. But I would rule that out because of such a secure environment." Basically, toxicity or whatever. So that's the story of West's involvement with Ruby. So then what happens afterwards? Well, 6 weeks later, That's when Jack Ruby gives his Warren report testimony, and Earl Warren and Gerald Ford. I forget who the attorneys were that came down, but they came to the jail and spoke to Ruby, and he gives this rambling, just wild testimony. And it kind of the testimony how you guys did a really nice job of dramatizing. I love how you guys do that, and you put the filter on the vocal, and you put the music behind it. You guys crush transcript. You do it really well. But anyway, he's paranoid, he's incoherent, and he keeps talking about it was very meta. He's like, well, when I testify, I'd have a lot to say. I can't, there would be so much I would have to say. And Warren's like, what kind of things would you say? He's like, if I told you what I had to say, I'd be saying a lot. It was just like a lot of back. And then he wanted lie detector tests, and he wanted to be taken to Washington to tell the truth. And basically, it seems like to the noided among us that they brought in the guy who's the expert at making people have acute psychotic breaks to give Ruby an acute psychotic break. And then he did, in fact, do that right before the Warren Commission testimony. Now, it's not right before, it's 6 weeks before. It would be more sus, I suppose, if it was like a few days before. But still quite suspect because they continued to check afterwards and he was still crazy. So
Yeah.
your thoughts on all that, and then we'll conclude, then we'll get to Litwin's rebuttals.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely never recovered from that psychotic break because, and I think it's worth zeroing in on exactly what the nature of his psychosis was, as reported, on the record here. He became extremely paranoid that there was a big conspiracy, an anti-Semitic conspiracy to launch pogroms against American Jews and to blame American Jews for the assassination of JFK. And he's talking about acute visual hallucinations, which is not something that ordinarily accompanies just your average like schizophrenia in onset with no previous signs of schizophrenia whatsoever. Like you said, all of his previous examinations hadn't turned up any indications of a condition like that. And yet now he's saying that he's describing visual hallucinations where he's seeing his siblings tortured in the streets and like torn limb from limb and burned alive in these horrific visual, very vivid scenes that if you are kind of scratching your head in the year 2025 about what might have caused that, I think some hallucinogenic drug would come to the top of your mind. But of course, in 1964, LSD was not a household word yet. It would still be a couple more years before the hippies and the Summer of Love and Timothy Leary and all of that pops off. But in 1964, even a psychiatrist in practice wouldn't necessarily, unless they're one of these CIA shrinks, of course, but outside of that community, wouldn't necessarily have familiarity with the types of effects of these very powerful hallucinogenic drugs that Jolyon West was extremely practiced in administering and in studying. So I think that it seems consistent with a drug-induced psychotic break, perhaps accompanied by some sort of hypnotic suggestion that gets Jack Ruby on this thought process. Jack Ruby doesn't know what to make of it. When he's talking to the Warren Commission, he's talking about there is a John Birch Society conspiracy. He's talking about powerful forces that are conspiring with each other to pin the blame for the assassination, not of Oswald, but of Kennedy on him, on Jack Ruby, and to take out the punishment for that crime on his siblings in particular and on American Jews more broadly. And so when it's really, in my mind, a key fact that he's afraid of something happening to the people that he cares about, even beyond himself. And he says that too in his testimony. He says like, forget about me. But they're gonna create another world war essentially.
Yeah.
So he's very much on a one-track mind from April '64 when this all pops off to the few years left in his life until whenever it is December of '66, I think, or January
Yeah.
of '67 when he passes away.
Are you hip to the legal doctrine of res ipsa loquitur? Familiar with that?
You know, I when I saw that on your outline, I got a flashback to 1L year. I don't think I've seen the phrase since then.
So the idea is it's Latin. The thing speaks for itself, and in the law, if you can get something as res ipsa loquitur, then you have a lower standard that you have to prove because it's like, well, obviously this happened. It's so obvious. To me, that's kind of what I would how I would classify the question of did Jolly West cause Ruby's psychotic break on purpose on behalf of the CIA? I think that's the thing speaks for itself. You've got West seeking involvement in Ruby's case, which is disputed. We'll get to the rebuttal in a second. You've got Ruby's breakdown occurring right after West visits. You have causation. You've got Jolly West uniquely had the skills and the background to induce psychosis. Jolly West worked directly for Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the CIA technical division. It's disputed that he did at the time, but he certainly did in the past, and all the records have been destroyed. West's close associate, so one of his best friends who worked with him in the military and at the University of Oklahoma, which is called OU, hilariously. But anyway, this guy says that Tom O'Neill asked him, you knew Jolly West well. Do you think he would have done this? Do you think he would have tried to scramble Ruby's brain, on behalf of the CIA? And the best friend was like, absolutely. He definitely
Yeah.
would have. That totally sounds like Jolly to me. I'm not joking. I mean, that's what he said. So, and then, as you mentioned, this same person, Jolly West, is also involved in Timothy McVeigh. He's involved with Sirhan. He's involved with, you said, Patty Hearst. I mean, it just the hits keep coming with this guy, Charles Manson. I mean, goodness gracious, what I don't know how one could look at this body of evidence and go, nothing there.
Yeah, and not only, was he involved in, again, in quotes, treating Jack Ruby, he in sort of inserted himself into the Ruby family and became very close with Ruby's sister, who was sort of overseeing his defense at the end of his life. Like they were corresponding with each other, they were very close. And Jolly West was a charismatic guy. He was famously a real philanderer, got a lot of women all over the country wherever he would go. He had the techniques at his fingertips, right? So he's able to not only induce this psychosis in Jack Ruby, but also to kind of, you know, protect the perimeter, let's say, secure the perimeter around Jack Ruby so that he has some insight into what information is getting out from Jack and about Jack and what information is getting in and filtering information to Jack because he has so much access to Jack, through, you mentioned Hubert Winston Smith, another one of these shrinks he was a JD MD. He was a lawyer and a medical doctor in huge in like the intersection of law and medicine at the time. He would put on these seminars in the various universities where he had been set up, and in that process became connected with, and acquainted with every big name in the sort of MKUltra scene. He was close with Alton Oshner, who was working for the CIA in New Orleans and was a big right-wing guy, a medical doctor. He was working with Melvin Belli, was a regular attendee at his seminars. So was Jolly West, of course, and a kind of who's who of MKUltra psychiatrists that were around this orbit. And so it's very again, just like with the mob stuff, it would be one thing if, maybe one guy had some connections to the intelligence community with respect to MKUltra, but it's not just one guy. It's like everybody.
Right.
And they're all connected to each other, and there's a community of interest there in uh, keeping their stories straight with each other.
Right. Let's get to a rebuttal here. So this is from Fred Litwin, and just so everyone knows, I put out on Twitter, X, whatever, a list of questions seeking feedback from some of the most well-known proponents of the Oswald did it alone theory. And Fred was gracious enough to get back with a response. Obviously, we disagree, but I do give a shout out to Fred for engaging and yeah, there you go. So let's talk about it. Number one, Fred says that Jolly West did not petition the court to be Jack Ruby's psychiatrist. So what I've said is that Jolly West inserted himself into the case, and Fred says that's not true. So he cites two newspaper articles that came out on November 30th, 1963, in support of the idea that Jolly West was involved in the question of who would be Ruby's psychiatrist early on. But from the newspaper articles, it wasn't clear whether Jolly West was even going to be the psychiatrist, just that he was helping to put a team of psychiatrists together. One article says it was West's idea, another one says that someone came to West with the idea. So my response to this is that this analysis ignores Tom O'Neill's book Chaos on pages 377 and 378, where he says, quote, West hoped to assemble a panel of experts in behavior problems to weigh in on Ruby's mental state. He took the extraordinary measure of approaching Judge Joe B. Brown, who'd impaneled the grand jury that indicted Ruby. West wanted the judge to appoint him to the case. Okay, so you may say, great, Matt, you're citing a book by some guy. Who cares? So what's the footnote in Tom O'Neill's book? On page 496 of the notes, we see that this comes from the notes of Jolly West himself. So Jolly West's personal notes in outline form for a book he was writing that was never published. So we've got two newspaper articles versus the horse's mouth himself, Jolly West, saying that he did approach Judge Joe B. Brown to appoint him to the case. So that's my response there. Fred's got another point. The second point on this is that Jolly West wasn't really a big deal when it comes to MKUltra. We're totally overblowing this. West didn't cause the psychotic break. It was just a coincidence, and West was the first one to notice it. Litwin says, quote, why should the CIA explain its relationship with Dr. West in 1964? Should they respond to unsupported allegations? What government agency or corporation, for that matter, would respond to unsubstantiated claims? And Litwin's main point here is that since we can't draw a line that shows that West was working with the CIA in 1964, we don't have a letter from Gottlieb to West that says, hey, I want you to go and scramble Jack Ruby's brain, or even anything after the incident with the elephant that conclusively shows or would demonstrate that he was working for the CIA in 1963. So, Fred says that everything he does is not nefarious because there's just no document to show that he's working with the CIA. What I would say in response to that is that analysis ignores that, number one, Sidney Gottlieb had this personal relationship with West where he's writing to him, and he even, encouraged West to take the job at the University of Oklahoma. And number two, the CIA paid for Jolly West's mistake when he poisoned this elephant in 1962. And look, the main headline here is all the documents were destroyed. So there are some things where you're not going to have documents, but you just have to look at real life things like the elephant and the CIA paying for the elephant. That's a big deal. And it is a sort of a classic inference split. But to me, I think what we've gone over here is overwhelming. Does the rebuttal of Fred Litwin change your analysis, Don?
No, it especially so on the first point, I would say beyond what O'Neill reports in Chaos, Max Arvo wrote, he elaborated and kind of documented even more. He went to the Jolly West archives, and he's got an article up on Jim DiEugenio's website, Kennedy's and King, that really painstakingly goes through all of what the West papers say about the period immediately after the assassination of Lee Oswald. And I think it's pretty clear from the primary sources that he cites there that are the same ones that O'Neill looked at, but in more detail. It just makes it quite clear that, in fact, West was he kind of initiated, maybe with some other of his associates from the American Psychiatric Association, which we know is very intimately connected with the CIA, the idea, and that again he lied about the idea having originated in Dallas. He said that it came from, some people in Dallas that wanted him to get involved. That appears to not have been true. And it's just another instance of Jolly West bending the truth to fit the narrative that he wants to get out there. And as for the second point, I mean, again, MKUltra, even some of the scientists and psychiatrists that worked for MKUltra, worked on subprojects, some of them didn't even know that they were working for the CIA because of this network of intermediary fronts that the CIA set up in order to maintain the secrecy of what was a mass domestic torture program, clearly in violation not only of the CIA's charter, but also of the US Constitution. And so, when you are violating the Constitution on such a mass scale, regardless of whether you believe that that's in the interest of national security, you are going to take pains to cover that up. And the idea that because there's not a smoking gun document says anything about the absence of actual fire there, where there's so much smoke, I don't take that. I don't agree with that at all. Let's just be polite.
Sure. All right, let's quickly move on to Ruby's confessions, and then we'll wrap up here. There are two instances where Jack Ruby's on tape, and it's used by folks on the critical side, me included, to demonstrate that Ruby's telling us that there's more than meets the eye to this. So I just want to talk about those, and then I've got a rebuttal from Litwin on those as well. So he tells a reporter on video that if Adlai Stevenson were the vice president, the assassination would have never happened. And, you got to think through what that means. It's an implication about LBJ, but it doesn't. I think some folks in the LBJ did it camp will take that quote. And the reason I'm relying heavily on the quote is because it's recorded. You could listen to it. You can watch the video of it still. So it definitely happened. Some people take that quote to say, oh, he's saying the vice president did it. The vice president killed Kennedy. But as I read that quote and really think about it, what he's saying is that if Adlai Stevenson, who had similar policies as JFK in a lot of areas, more similar than LBJ, if he was president, then perhaps the people who wanted him out of there wouldn't have been so eager to kill him because there wouldn't have been someone that had different views from JFK backing him up to ascend. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's also, Ruby did have these mob connections, and as we know, LBJ had shady connections in his own right. And it's plausible to me that Ruby would have been at least abstractly aware, if not in detail, that LBJ is tied up with these forces that he considers to be sort of a conspiratorial, nefarious group of people that are acting in Dallas. What he calls, I think George Senator, Jack Ruby's roommate, said that Ruby thought there was a conspiracy of either the John Birch Society or the Communist Party, or maybe both. So I think it's a little bit unsophisticated and imprecise, but to say that there's something bigger out there operating, and anybody that actually knows sort of beyond the public persona of LBJ, as you very exhaustively covered in your LBJ series, like the guy, even if he didn't order the hit on JFK, he certainly did have a lot of fingers in a lot of different dirty little pies around Dallas and around Texas more generally.
Sure. Sure. But I mean, it's like even so, that quote is not something that a lone nut would say. If he just killed Oswald to protect Jackie from a trial, then what does who the vice president would be have to do with anything? You know what I mean?
Right. And I think, also remember that Adlai Stevenson had been in Dallas and had been also attacked or threatened just a few, I don't know if it was weeks or months before, but sometime
In
proximate in
October.
time to yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the other big Ruby quote is the famous, everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The whole world never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people who have so much to gain and have such a material motive to put me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world. And then a reporter says, "These people are in very high positions, Jack." And he says, "Yes." Well, that one to me was always like, oh my gosh, this is one of the biggest smoking guns in the case. And I still think it's a really big deal. But Fred Litwin's got a rebuttal on this. He doesn't have a rebuttal for the first point we talked about, just the second quote. And he argues that this quote's taken out of context, and Ruby isn't talking about the truth generally. He's talking about the truth regarding his Warren Commission testimony specifically. I read this argument, but the added context does not make it clear to me that Ruby is talking about his Warren Commission testimony. And even if he is, what's the Warren Commission testimony about? After all, it's about the case. So, I mean, just read again, res ipsa loquitur. The words speak for themselves. And if there was some paragraph before this that totally undermined the point, I'd be the first one to tell you about it. But from what I've seen on Fred's website, I'm not sold that this is referencing anything other than what it sounds like, which is the case at large. Perhaps in the context of the Warren Commission testimony, but he's still talking about the case. So your thoughts on that rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, this one is not at all persuasive to me because Ruby's statement here, as I've kind of pointed out with a few allusions throughout here, it is not his only statement about a larger conspiracy. This echoes statements that he's already made, including to the Warren Commission. When Jack Ruby tells Earl Warren, "Your life is in danger, Chief Justice Warren," it, it's not in danger from Jack Ruby, the lone nut, right? He's in
Right.
jail. He's poses no threat to anybody. So who is he talking about? He's talking about people that have the ability even to take out the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And that's why he wants to go to Washington. I think because he thinks that, if he can talk to basically the president, like it will take that level of organized power to take on the forces that Jack Ruby thinks are behind this conspiracy. But it's very evident from the statement itself, especially when compared to other similar statements that he's made about a larger conspiracy in other contexts, that he's not talking about his Warren Commission testimony. And another point that, I debated this back and forth with Fred on Twitter as well, that he said something like, with respect to the polygraph, that Jack Ruby, Fred Litwin attached significance to the fact that Jack Ruby really insisted on taking this polygraph and wanted it to be made public. And in his polygraph examination, which was subsequently determined to be absolutely useless and unreliable, including by the Warren Commission that declined to use it at all, and by the HSCA that just said it was not worth the paper it was printed on. But he says that he was not part of a broader conspiracy under the polygraph examination. And Fred says because he wanted that to be public, that signifies that he really wanted the world to know that there was no conspiracy. And not only does that contradict these other later in time statements that he made, but it also is consistent with the sort of thesis that I've developed, which is he's trying to protect his family from murder or
Mhm.
torture at the hands of the people that he's referring to here, the people that put him in the position he is in. That not only can they do whatever they want to him, that he's a lost cause, he says it's in as many words, but the other people in his life, he doesn't want to see them, tortured to death. I think that that's a sincerely felt belief on Ruby's part and consistent with his entire psychosis post Jolly West.
Sure. All right, well let's just quickly wrap up here. I know it's been a long episode and I appreciate your time today. Was Ruby Mafia affiliated? One of the big questions we wanted to answer. I mean, I think we answered this already. I mean, for me the answer is no, he wasn't a made man. No, he wasn't on the org chart. But his whole life he's mafia adjacent. Everything he's doing, he's completely surrounded by mafia linked people. So, yes, I would say he is sufficiently mafia affiliated for the purposes of our question.
A
What about you?
hundred percent, 100% agree. Even Melvin Belli's law partner, Cy Ellison, said that he got a call that from a mobster that he knew saying, "Hey, you guys need to get in there and take care of our guy Ruby for us." And then later on, the same mobster called back and told Ellison, "You know what? Actually, you can still represent him, but we're not going to be holding your hand on it. There's bigger forces at play here."
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. So, all right. So that's the first question we were trying to answer. The second big question, why did Ruby kill Oswald? And before we answer that, I want to address Fred Litwin's rebuttal. So Fred says that Ruby killing Oswald was an impulsive act, and he came up with a lot of different reasons for it after the fact. So, in other words, who cares why he says it? The reason is it was just impulsive, and so anything he says, other than it was just impulsive, is just kind of making it up. Looking at this, I came across a document that when I was, it was actually when I was researching the Dorothy Kilgallen episode about a guy named Garnett Hallmark who owned the garage across the street from the Carousel Club. And he had a phone in there in his office, and he let Ruby come in and use the phone. And there's an FBI report about this. And also, Hallmark testified to the Warren Commission. And he said that Ruby was pretending to be a reporter on Saturday afternoon after the assassination. Ruby told him that. I'm acting like a reporter today. Okay, geez, why? And number two, Ruby said on the phone, so this guy Hallmark overhears Ruby using the phone in his office that he's letting Ruby use. He overhears Ruby say that he would be there for the transfer of Oswald. So he said that to the person he's talking to. I'll be there when Oswald is transferred. And so this is from Hallmark's Warren Commission testimony. So to me, you combine that with the whole thing I covered in episode 26 about Karen Carlin and how Ruby set up that he would be at Western Union. He's the one that was his idea to go to the Western Union. To me, this impulsive act thing, I just think that's not consistent with the facts. But everything that we've talked about, it seems like Ruby's relieved after Oswald's killed. There's all these things that just are out there in the literature, many of which we've discussed today. I think Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald to silence him, and I think he did it because he was told he had to do it. So that's from the Mafia. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean I don't remember if you covered this in your Ruby episodes, but the statement of Billy Grammer, the Dallas police detective who got a call at 3 in the morning
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the 24th and said that it was Jack Ruby. He, was very clear and identified Jack Ruby as the person on the other end of the line who called him middle of the night and said, we're gonna be careful when you're transferring Oswald tomorrow. He's gonna get killed. And the FBI even reported on it too. So I
Yeah.
don't see how you can ignore all of these indicia of premeditation. And, obviously, the way that you ignore that is by paying attention to the well-planned alibi involving the Western Union.
Right.
But I'm with you that, he was in a lot of debt. He was desperate man, no doubt about it. He was, as he said, taking drugs, uppers in particular, Preludin, and I think he was mixing them with some barbiturates and other things to calm his nerves. So he's unstable for sure, but he's unstable in a way that reflects his life circumstance, that he could go to jail because of his massive tax debts. He could get everything taken away from him. He could get clipped by the same mafiosi who put him up to it in the first place, right? So
Right.
there's any number of reasons that would motivate him to roll the dice and hit Oswald with a perhaps not totally misplaced belief that he could get away with it, or that he would get a slap on the wrist or otherwise be afforded a hero's welcome by the people of Dallas for saving the good name of Dallas. Because it is also true that a lot of people felt ashamed that Dallas had become synonymous with the assassination of the president and wanted to reclaim some dignity. And, I don't think it's beyond belief that Jack Ruby would have thought, hey, you know what? This guy Oswald, this, commie rat that killed our president in my city, he's got to get his comeuppance.
Yeah.
And if the Dallas police is on my side, which it was, nothing can keep me down, and it's certainly better than the fate that I know that I'll meet if I remain a deadbeat and I can't pay off these bills.
Right. Yeah, episode 26, I did touch on Billy Grammer calling in. And also, there's these guys in a, TV van, three of them, three witnesses, all of whom said that Ruby was walking around before asking if they knew what time Oswald was coming out. So,
Hmm.
so there are many, many instances. This was a good episode, and I think we answered a controversial and pivotal question. And I think the answer to who killed JFK and who ordered all that. I think that is still something I'm looking at. I've ruled some things out. I'm zooming in more, but the exact mix of all these different potential culprits is somewhat of an open question for me still. But I think Jack Ruby's role is pretty clear at this point, and Jolly West is the cherry on top that absolutely makes it's a slam dunk to me that he was put there to make Ruby not be capable of telling any of the truth. So there you go. Sorry, Fred. I know you disagree, but thanks for engaging with us and giving us your perspective. And yeah, I know you got to get out of here. Solving JFK listeners, do check out Fourth Reich Archaeology. Some of you guys may not like their politics, but I'm just telling you, you're all going to love their historical deep dives because they're great. We'll be off for a week or two, and then diving into Israel in January. So looking forward to getting hate mail from both sides, and that'll tell me that I'm on the right track. Uh,
Oh yeah, we didn't even get into Hillel Silverman, Jack
oh,
Ruby's rabbi, who was in the IDF, well, not the IDF, but the Haganah during the 1948 Nakba.
I have a feeling I'm not done with Ruby, and I'm going to have a Ruby subsection within my Israel series. I think so. Well, maybe we'll come back. But
Fun times for sure.
thanks again for joining us, Don.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
All right. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.